Okay, good morning, everyone. My name's Eli Storch. I chair the Design Advocacy Group, and it's great to have you here for our January 2022 meeting on rental code enforcement in Philadelphia. Um, Hard to believe that we are more than a year into our Zoom version of these DAG monthly meetings, with our first being back in September 2020, but here we are. So as we normally do with DAG, we start off with any announcements, any advocacy items, exhibitions, events, things around town. So if you have anything to share, please put it in the chat and I'll call on you to unmute and say a few words about whatever you have going on. So please take that opportunity and put anything you have in the chat right now. If you have any technical difficulties, you can message me, you can message David Brownlee, you can message our wonderful DAG fellow, Lachelle Weathers, and we will do our best to help you. So three of us will be here throughout to help if there's anything that comes up, but please stay muted throughout the recording. Normally, our DAG meetings have been off the record, but with the pandemic and the ability to share to a wider audience through Zoom, we have made the decision to record them and put them on our website. So back to September of 2020, you can go back and check out a lot of really good content, some really wonderful meetings as we've been focused on on issues relating to Black Lives Matter and the ongoing unrest in the US and around cities in the country, as we've been looking at different equity issues, as well as design, larger projects, all sorts of issues that relate to housing. Go take a look, see what you see, and there's a lot of content on there that is all on our YouTube page as well. And if you like what you see and you are enjoying DAG's content, I'll do our what is hopefully the last plug of our financial campaigning year, to go to our website and click on that support DAG button. Apologies for that. Click on our support DAG button. We're within $1,000 of our campaign goal, so we're very, very close, and appreciate everyone who's contributed. You can read our letter there from DAG's honorary chair, Denise Scott Brown, who we were incredibly fortunate to have join us and support DAG this year. So please, we're very close, and your contributions are 100% tax deductible. So if you haven't yet, please send a few bucks our way. It's very much appreciated. And hopefully that's the last I will speak of fundraising until we do it all again later this new year. So a couple things as we get started on the announcement side. David, do you want to say a few words on advocacy and affordable housing?
Yes, indeed. I'm sure that many of you have been following the story of the award-winning housing that was built to the design of Friday Associates at 40th and Market Street about 30 years ago, and the unfortunate fact that the permanence of that housing arrangement is not written into the way that we have been providing it. DAG is preparing a position paper that argues for the necessity of the involved parties to come together to ensure the permanence of affordable housing in Philadelphia. Watch for it soon. We're trying to position it in the public press, and we are not quite there yet, but one way or another, we'll get our position out quite soon.
Thank you, David. Couple other items to share. So the CDR has released some new guidelines about how processes will be working with CDR in 2022. I just added a link to it in the chat, so you can go take a look at that. Basically, they've been inundated and a little overrun, so they're extending some of the time requirements in order to get to provide enough time for their staff to adequately review and opine on projects. So instead of 3 weeks submission in advance, they're going to need to be 4 weeks. In addition, they're also making some clarifications about your inability to submit without L&I referral, priority to projects that have met with RCOs, and available preliminary meetings to meet with staff to make sure things have been cleared up and are ready to go. So yes, that is something to take a look at, something to note, and that's something that is coming this year for anyone out there in the design development community world to consider. On the DAG front, we are continuing our Streeteries initiative. So we're meeting weekly and working through developing some of our own design guidelines and thoughts as they relate to Streeteries once we're past pandemic conditions and moving into just outdoor amenity dining and what that might look like. So if you're interested in learning more about that, getting more involved, you can contact Lachelle at dagfellow@gmail.com. And that's something that's going to be ongoing. To answer David's question in the chat, we have not yet taken a position on that project. That's been an interesting back and forth. If you're not seeing the chat, David's mentioning the project at 50th and Springfield, and the back and forth between more units, more parking, location of building masses, surface parking in front of the project. Definitely something that we need to be considering. And David, if you would like to write up a forum piece on it, we would love to publish it. But we have not yet taken a position on it. So I'm going to next bring it in Marcia. Marcia, do you want to talk a little bit about some upcoming events at DAG?
Right. Thanks, Eli, and hi, everybody. Our program next month will tentatively feature Christine Williamson, who has dedicated herself to teaching building science and construction to architects and other building industry professionals. Now with the Department of Licenses and Inspections, Christine will be discussing general changes that are hoped to be seen in the building industry. That's February 24th at 10 a.m. And then with a peek at future programs on March 24th, Rebecca Chan, director of the Friends of the Rail Park, will be discussing its second phase report. And moving on to April 21st, Alexa Bossi, director of design at Hinge Collective, will present the Philly Tree Plan. All very exciting. Eli?
Thank you, Marcia. Those will all be up on our website in the next week or so. So we'll have a big dump of new opportunities that you can go click on and get your free tickets so you can join us as we move into the spring. So thank you, Marcia, for your continuing hard work on getting those all scheduled up. Before we get into our presentation today, any other events, please keep putting them in the chat, and I will make sure that we bring them up. Also, as we go through our program today, there will be a Q&A at the end. So as you have questions, as you think of things, please put them in the chat so we can pull from those as we do our Q&A with our presenters later. So not seeing anything, let's jump right in. Let's jump right into our presentation today. It is a real pleasure to have Octavia Howell and Sophie Bryan with us from Pew Charitable Trust to talk about code enforcement and rental house quality here in Philadelphia. Octavia Howell serves as a manager at Pew. She's focusing on Pew's Philadelphia Research and Policy Initiative, where she leads the housing research portfolio. Before joining Pew, Octavia spent 8 years working as a city planner for the city of Philadelphia. And we have Sophie Bryan. Sophie is a senior manager also in Pew's Philadelphia Research and Policy Initiative, where she leads the policy team. Her prior experience includes roles in the nonprofit, local government, and legal sectors. So please, our virtual quiet applause as we welcome Sophie and Octavia. I have the screen, so I'll share that. Thank you for joining us.
For having us, Eli. It is a treat to be here. I think with Octavia and her planning background and me as the daughter of an architect, like this is particularly meaningful to be with DAG today. And I'd be remiss if I didn't take the chance, which Eli generously offered, to start today by just noting that I imagine everyone's hearts and minds are heavy with the events yesterday in Fairmount, which surely drove home as ever the importance of access to safe and affordable and healthy housing. So with that sort of context and those very high stakes in mind, we're grateful for the chance to be with you all this morning. So next slide, please. We are going to just sort of the overview of what we hope to do this morning, just give a really quick introduction to the Philadelphia Research and Policy Initiative and the kinds of work we do, which no doubt is familiar to many of the folks in DAG membership. Octavia will take us through her terrific research on code enforcement in Philadelphia and peer cities. I will, largely parroting work from partners and MQ colleagues, talk a little bit about health impact assessments, a tool that we're using to translate that research into potential policy solutions. And then we are excited to be in conversation with you all on all those matters. So next slide, please. Just quickly on Philadelphia Research and Policy Initiative, we are part of Pew's Philadelphia program, which also includes grant making activities to support families and individuals facing complex challenges and also foster a vibrant arts community. The work we do in the Research and Policy Initiative is a combination of original research and data analysis, and also surfacing of policy solutions or promising practices from peer cities. So folks are likely familiar with our State of the City work and our polling work, both of which will be coming out early in, or sort of in the first half of this year. We do the housing work, which Octavia leads, and will sort of share the most recent products from. We have work on the city's opioid crisis in the civil legal system. And then also noted here are our recent and upcoming economic development and fiscal health bodies of work. Would encourage folks to check out our website. Among the resources there is our online dashboard that's tracking local businesses and jobs as the city continues to sort of persist through and try to recover from the pandemic. So I think with that context, it's the right time to hand it over to Octavia to sort of take us through this exciting and interesting recent research on code enforcement. So I will mute myself, and next slide, please, for Octavia.
Thanks, Sophie. Actually, I guess you can go right on to the next slide as well. I want to give you an overview of this work and why we did it. We have been really digging into the housing space, and really also, I think it kicked off a lot with our work on poverty, really understanding the impact that poverty had on people's ability to secure housing and maintain it. In Philadelphia, one of the things that we learned is that 4 out of 5 households that are experiencing poverty are living in unsubsidized housing that's in the private market, not in PHA units. And so we were really concerned with understanding what are the conditions in those properties. In addition to that, we have this context that Philadelphia, which has long been a home ownership city, is increasingly renter occupied. The latest numbers that we cited in this report, 48% of Philadelphia households are renting, and that's a big change for us. Poor tenants have less satisfaction with buildings maintenance, and they're more frequently responsible for maintaining the property themselves compared with tenants that are above the housing poverty line. And one thing we also understand is that Philadelphia is an old city with old housing units. Many of them have deferred needs, just generally speaking. And those substandard housing conditions, they can have serious impacts on health, vulnerability to injury. And so there are things that we want to think about, and also consider the fact that in a city where much of our rental housing stock is in single family homes that are attached, there are implications for households that are living, next to those properties that are not necessarily being protected. So we're thinking about understanding the rules and protections that are in place for renters, and really thinking as well about how that impacts the overall fabric of the city. Next slide, please. So what are the rules? In Philadelphia, the rental standards are dictated by a few city codes. It's the City Property Maintenance Code, the Fire Code, the Administrative Code, and the Zoning Code. Lots of, hundreds of pages of regulations that, some lay people can understand it, but there's a lot to understand and a lot to digest that is there. And the way that rental properties are regulated in Philadelphia, or the rules are applied, is that owners basically self-certify that they are in compliance with that code. They do that when they go through the process of obtaining a rental license, which is required for all landlords in the city. There is no additional inspection to make sure that there is true compliance. It's just a self-certification. Many landlords, however, don't bother to go through that step. They don't go and pay the $56 that's required to get that rental license so that the city knows who they are and where they are. 45% of all properties in the city are not licensed. There's a penalty for not having a license. It's a $300 fine for not having a rental license. It's considered a code violation. In Philadelphia, between 2016 and 2019, LNI issued more than 8,000 violation notice, and 79% of those were for 1 or 2 family dwelling units. This is an issue in Philadelphia because, unlike in some other places where rental housing is really ubiquitous, it is in large separate buildings. In Philadelphia, 82% of rental properties are in single family structures. And Philadelphia is not alone in struggling to get landlords to register their properties. Not that many cities track it because it's really hard to figure out what you don't know. But in Cleveland, they estimate that about 45% of rental properties are unregistered. And in New York City, they estimated that 20 to 30% of properties are unregistered. And it's those smaller properties that are more likely to be non-compliant. So there's properties that are similar to what we have in Philadelphia. Next slide. So as I mentioned, most rental inspections in Philadelphia are initiated by complaint. The city does not do what is called proactive inspection. And so what happens is an individual calls 311. It doesn't necessarily have to be the tenant. It can be a neighbor or a passerby. Anyone can issue a complaint and can do so anonymously if they choose. And as a result of this process, about 7% of all rental units in the city are inspected each year. So that's about 20,000 properties on average. Lots, but a small fraction of the rental properties that exist in the city of Philadelphia. New York, Chicago, San Diego, Milwaukee, all of those cities also are complaint driven. So Philadelphia, although it's a system that does not get all units looked at, we're in good company. It's, I think, the way that many cities have done it, particularly those large cities that have a large inventory of properties to keep track of. One thing to note, Philadelphia does inspect proactively for the fire code, and that's in those larger multifamily structures. And even there, they're looking at ingress and egress, making sure that they're looking at the public spaces, not necessarily going inside of a unit to see that things are up to code there. One of the things we wanted to look at is how does this happen in other cities? Proactive inspection, when it is done, it looks different in different cities. Some looked at just the exterior, similar to what we do in Philadelphia for the fire code. Some focus on a specific set of code requirements when they do go in and proactively look at things. They may not look at those hundreds of pages of code, but focus on the things that are most important for life safety. In Baltimore, for example, they have a list of 12 requirements that they always check for. They may check for other things, but they always check for these 12s. And some adjust the frequency. For example, in Baltimore, there's an initial, I believe it's, actually we can go to the next slide to show that. There's initial frequency where they plan to go in, but if your property is continuously found to be compliant, they reduce the frequency. So they may, instead of coming annually, may come every 2 years or every 3 years. So Philadelphia is we actually, just pulling back a little bit, for this study, as we do often with our research, we compare Philadelphia to cities that are similar to us on the metric that we're looking at. So for this study, we wanted to look at cities that had similarly aged housing stock and cities that had similarly high proportions of single family units that were being used as rentals. Not identical, but similar. And so Baltimore, Chicago, Cleveland, kind of down the list here are many of the major cities that we looked at for our most robust comparison. And as we mentioned, the rules vary across cities. Some cities don't keep track at all of rental properties. If you look at Chicago, the second one on the list, there's no requirement to register your property, as is the case in Philadelphia. So there's no fees, there's no time in which they will predictably inspect your property. And Philadelphia is one of 3 cities that do require rental properties to be registered, but don't require them to be inspected for code compliance to operate. So some cities, for example, in I think Washington, DC, before you can get that registration stamp to say, hey, I'm a rental property, an inspection needs to occur. And in other cities, it's done not necessarily at the time of inspection, but a year out or a certain number of months out, there will be an inspection. Going to the next slide, please. So one of the concerns with having a reactive system of enforcement as we have in Philadelphia is that it's virtually impossible to know the true condition of rental properties without an approach that's systematic. And as we mentioned before, the health and safety implications of the violations that we see the most in Philadelphia can be really serious. They seem benign when you look at it. It's interior surfaces or plumbing, and you might think, a leaky toilet, but it can be very serious. One of the things that we learned is that often water infiltration that you might have from a leaky roof, those types of things have been associated with many of the building collapses that we've seen in Philadelphia. Interior surfaces in a city that's as old as Philadelphia, if you have peeling paint or chip paint, you may be talking about, lead exposure. Also, where you have, again, thinking about that leaky roof, you may have mold and lots of different things that are happening when you have the deterioration of your building envelope can have not just minor inconveniences, but life safety implications for the households that are living there. Some tenants, even though we did say in the beginning, anyone can report and they can report anonymously, some tenants choose not to report just because there's a fear of retaliation. The reality is that even though there are these laws on the books, there are landlords who choose to retaliate. They choose to participate in what's called self-help eviction. And if they have a tenant that they find to be a problem, because they're making these complaints, they'll just change the locks, put their things out on the front steps. And so tenants, out of fear, sometimes choose not to report violations. Others don't necessarily recognize what recourses that they have. Your relationship is with the landlord and not, thinking about the government as a partner in your work. And so they don't know to call an L&I and choose not to call an L&I. Landlords are supposed to, when they get that rental license and when they have a new tenant, share something called the Partners for Good Housing Guidebook. It's basically lays out what the rights and the responsibilities are for both landlords and tenants. And it's something that is, a good resource that many people don't often know about. If you have a situation where you are a tenant and you're identifying that there are problems and not getting a response from a landlord, one option that tenants have is to go to the Fair Housing Commission. But this can only happen before an eviction action is filed in court. The Fair Housing Commission is run through the city and they have, legal weight, but it's their authority is subordinate to the courts. So once there is an official action filed in court, then they are not able to support and help a tenant to have a recourse for property violations. So really you have to be savvy, understand the legal processes in order to have protections. And you can really, you end up in court in most cases, or not in most cases, but in some cases. And so it's a really big deal to have a system that relies on tenants to know and be proactively engaged to make sure that their properties are in a quality condition. Next slide, please. So when there is a property violation, when someone has called and made that report, an L&I it's on L&I's radar. What happens is they prioritize the list of they prioritize the cases that are going to be inspected. They're based on severity. For lack of heat, the average is 48 hours that L&I will seek to have an inspector come out to visit a property. But on average, the first time to inspect a property is 21 days. Definitely have heard of and seen in the data that it can take much longer, but these are the standards and 21 days is the true average that it takes for the LNI to get out and take a look at the property. And one thing that's important to note is that once they do get out for that inspection, that's not the end of the process. LNI analysis showed that 29% of complaints that hadn't been resolved a year after that first complaint. The code stipulates that owners can be given about a month after the first inspection to correct a violation. And after that happens, after those 35 days pass, LNI, depending on the type of notice that is issued, they may come out and reinspect, or there's a different process I'll get into in the next slide. One thing to mention though is an inspector has discretion on whether they can require you to require a landlord to make an immediate change or even stop operations at a property if there are serious violations. Next slide, please. So what are the types of tools that LNI inspectors use? The most common is actually the second one listed on this slide here. It's a notice of violation. Most of the time when they come out, they are issuing this notice of violation that gives them up to 30 days. It can be as few as, as I said, immediate, or often 5 days if there's something that's urgent that really needs to be repaired, but you may have to call in support to get it done. There's no financial penalty if the violations are corrected. To be clear, fines do accrue daily. We mentioned for not having that rental license is $300. That's the lowest rate of accrual. And so from the time that an inspection is identified, there is a financial clock ticking. Every day, if you have a code violation that hasn't been corrected, you're paying, or you are being assessed $300, $1,000, or $2,000 a day. If you do not make the corrections and the case ends up in court, that's the point at which those fines are actually levied, and it's determined by the courts whether or not a fine and how much that fine will be levied. Most of the time, if a case does end up in court, it can take up to 180 days to get a case to court. The fines are way above the limit of the city's municipal court, and so the court does have a lot of discretion on how much and whether to impose a fine. And so as I was kind of going back to the sequence here, like if there are repeated failed inspections, LNI refers the case to the law department, who refers it to the courts, and they go through that process. There's another way. The city has been increasingly using something called code violations and more recently site violation notices. And those are a little bit more like a ticket. There's a set penalty. It's a fraction of that $300 fine that LNI may issue for code violation notices. It's $75. They come in, they say, here's a problem. It may be a situation where it can be fixed immediately, or it needs to be fixed immediately, and the inspector has confidence that it is a simple fix and something they have confidence that the landlord will correct, and they can issue that notice. There is that financial penalty, but what doesn't happen is that there is no reinspection. No one's coming back to check to make sure that it happens, and it's not in a process that's going to get them to court if there's a lack of violation. Now, of course, a tenant can, a lack of correction, excuse me, a tenant can call LNI again and say, hey, this hasn't been fixed. And if that occurs, then LNI will return and issue that notice of violation. One thing to note is that about 7,000 cases, so we said there are about 20,000 inspections of rental properties, about 7,000 of them end up in court each year based on the most recent few years of data. Next slide. So what are some of the challenges for code enforcement? One of them is incomplete and inconsistent data. I mentioned before that it can take up to 180 days, or as many as 180 days, for a case to go from inspection and recognizing that you have a non-compliant owner to being in court. Part of that time is identifying who the owners are. And if you look if any of you have ever looked in LNI's data, you'll see that there's often inaccurate data, incomplete data. And so it's really essential that that information be correct so that the city can provide proper service. If there isn't proper service, this is a legal case. So if there isn't proper service, then you can't really have proper enforcement. And so that's one of the issues that the city has. If there's incomplete data, then you can't really move forward. And this happens both for two reasons, really. One, as we mentioned before, 45% of landlords don't register. And then the other is that making sure that contact information is up to date is a challenge. There are rules on the books in Philadelphia that require contact information to be updated within 10 days of a change. Everyone doesn't necessarily comply to that. Some landlords also seek to kind of be under the radar and mask their identity. There has been recent regulation to try to get at those landlords that are kind of hiding behind an LLC. But it's actually really widespread, where you have landlords who have more than one name that they're going by. They either have multiple names or multiple addresses. And we found that up to about a quarter of all landlords have their properties under multiple holdings, where they're making it difficult to identify who the owner is. There are cities, and in Philadelphia has also taken this approach or attempted this approach, where we're finding that there's a particular landlord that is repeatedly having violations. They'll go and identify all of their properties and have an action against all of those properties. That's much more difficult to do when you are masking your identity. And that's a challenge that we have in Philadelphia. And then there's what are the penalties? In Philadelphia, as I said, it's a code violation to not be registered, and there is a penalty. I'm not sure what the specific penalty is for not having your information updated, but it is a violation. But in some cities, you have some pretty aggressive penalties. And one that kind of stands out to me is in Maricopa County, which includes the city of Phoenix. A tenant can actually terminate a lease and collect back rent if a unit is found to be unregistered and they go for more than 10, like if it's identified and after 10 days they haven't made the correction, they can collect all the back rent they've gotten off of that unit or that they've paid for that unit. And so one of the other issues is how the city collects its data. Some of you may be familiar with the city using a system called Hanson, and in that system, the data was relatively unstandardized. As a part of this process for trying to identify who the landlords were in Philadelphia and where the rental properties were, we really dug into the data. And one thing that we found that was kind of striking and upsetting was that there were at least 50 different ways to spell Philadelphia in the property ownership data. It's completely unstandardized under the old system. Now the city is no longer working with Hanson, and they have a new system called Eclipse that gives them opportunities to really improve their data collection and data management. And so there's hope that there will be improvements in how the data is collected. For example, in addition to those inconsistencies in how data is entered, in the past, you could go for unlicensed for an extended period of time, and that data could be overwritten, like when you get your license. So let's say you want to evict someone. I think we may not have mentioned this. One of the penalties for not having a rental license is that you cannot take a case to court for eviction. But some landlords had a practice of keeping a property unlicensed until they need to take a court action. And at that point, they would get their rental license, and it would not be visible, basically the way the system was working. So the new Eclipse system has some opportunities for improving some data inconsistency issues. The other big challenge for thinking about improving how the city inspects rental properties is that the city has, or LNI, I should say, has limited resources. They're the primary agency that's responsible for code enforcement, and they would need at least $3.4 million per year to switch to a proactive inspection regime where they were looking at every unit over a 5-year cycle. They need additional $3.4 million per year, but the department does generate enough revenue to do that. The way that it works, even though they aren't always collecting heavy fines, they bring in $65 million on average, and only have $38 million budgeted. But the way that the city's or that the department's resources go, they go directly to the general fund, and they're reallocated through the city's annual budget process. And so they would need a big increase in their operations in order to change the regime on how they do inspections. Another big thing, thinking about LNI's limited resources, is that code enforcement for rental properties is one of many responsibilities. There are many other things that they're supposed to do, including, as we mentioned, the fire code enforcement, which was one of their initial, when they were initially chartered, one of their big responsibilities. But they also inspect commercial buildings, daycare facilities, auto repair shops. LNI does not have a shortage of things to do, but it does have a shortage of resources and a shortage of staff. Another is the difficulty of training and attracting and retaining inspectors. Some cities also complain of struggling in this area. And one way that it's done in other places is to really outsource some of that inspection activity rather than trying to seek to hire. They sometimes use third-party inspectors where the property owner will pay someone to come in and do the inspection rather than wait for the city to be able to get out. Washington, D.C. has an interesting model where they use gig workers to do inspections. The city has a program wherein they train city residents to learn how to do property inspections, and they do it sort of on an on-call basis, and they will do not only rental properties, but also commercial properties as well. So they're providing employment to residents who need it, as well as getting those properties inspected. Oh, I'm noticing we're a couple slides behind. Can you advance, please? One more. We're out of sync. Can you go back one? All right, there we go. Sorry about that. So one of the other issues, the impact on tenants. I think that advocates are concerned, and I think the city also has a sensitivity to the fact that all units are not necessarily going to be able to come into compliance. And so increased enforcement means increased opportunities for displacement. Boarding houses where you have homes that are divided into multiple units, a living room may become a bedroom, a basement may become a home where they're not necessarily allowed to do so by zoning. Some of those are not able to come into zoning compliance. So there's a concern that people would be displaced as a result of increased enforcement. Another is just that for those tenants that are in substandard units, there's a potential for increased rents. Landlords will have to, make repairs, and some landlords may pass those costs on to their tenants. In Baltimore, it was found that as the city made more units required to have to be inspected and be registered, that there were landlords who decided that they were done, that they needed to exit the market entirely. They weren't able to make that business model work for them anymore. So I think there's a concern for a loss of housing as well. And then there's also just the lack of capacity among some landlords. In Detroit, or actually I believe it was in Cleveland, when they instituted proactive inspection, they found that many of the landlords needed extra time to make those repairs, to gather the funds to bring their properties up to code. And so it's not necessarily going to be a speedy shift. And in the meantime, those tenants are continuing to live in properties that are not necessarily meeting the standard. And finally, there is a weak pipeline of support for displaced tenants. In our past study on affordability, we learned that there's nearly twice as many low-income renter households than housing units they can afford. Sometimes when those units when they go away or people displaced, there's just nowhere for anyone to go. And so I think that that's a concern that we have and that we would want to continue to think about as we think about making sure that homes are safe. There's also the affordability concern. Next slide. And so how do we address this? What do we do about it? Sophie's going to talk in a bit about how cities think about the health impacts of all of this, but I want us to think about what the city has done so far and what other cities are doing. As we mentioned before, in trying to understand who we're talking about, what are the impacts of looking at code enforcement, we wanted to understand who those landlords were. Are we talking about big absentee landlords from New York City? Or are we talking about mom and pop landlords, which we hear a lot about? And we did find that in Philadelphia, most landlords are local mom and pop landlords with one or two units that they're managing. A 2020 study found that 23% of Philly landlords had difficulty paying for property repairs or renovations before the pandemic, and those needs only increased as things got more challenging over the past 2 years. One of the things that the city has done to support landlords is the creation of loan funds. The city has 2 different loan funds to help landlords to make those repairs. Some other cities have some that, if they give you a loan, for example, New York City also adds stipulations for ongoing affordability. Some landlords don't necessarily need help, they need incentives to make repairs. And for those, there are liens where cities may come in and do the repairs and put a lien against the property. In Los Angeles, they may put a lien on a property, and any rents that are paid to that landlord have to go to escrow, and they can only be drawn down to make repairs to the property until the property comes into compliance. In Chicago, there's a program that uses conservatorship, where a conservator will make the repairs and try to get the owners to pay for the repairs, and if not, will transfer the ownership to another organization. And so lots to think about in terms of both what the need is and then how we can help to address the need and how the city can support it. I am going to go ahead and pass off to Sophie so she can talk to us a bit about HIA.
Thanks, Octavia. Next slide, and then I'll pause for a second here. So, as Octavia was leading this research and sort of its findings were coming to light, it was clear, as I imagine it's been clear to all of you during her presentation and from your sort of your knowledge of the context, that this is a multifaceted problem with many stakeholders involved and with sort of competing concerns, and sort of just seeing David's note here in the chat right now, sort of external factors that do impact what landlords can do and what conditions tenants are experiencing. And so sort of confronted with that, knowing that we had sort of original research that was interesting and pointed to some problems and challenges, we thought hard about what approach might Pew take to come up with a roster of policy solutions, then test out those solutions and sort of crowdsource in some ways the identification of ones that could be advanced. And so the tool that we're using to do that, which I will talk about a little bit, is something called a health impact assessment. So before doing so, a little bit of what no doubt will be a remedial discussion about social determinants of health for this knowledgeable group. So next slide, please, Eli. And here we are borrowing a graphic from the Bipartisan Policy Center, which basically, makes in visual form the point that your zip code can be as, if not more important than your genetics code when it comes to your health. So as folks in the Zoom room know, a whole series of factors influence our physical health other than access to clinical health care. And yet much of our spending collectively on being healthy is related to medical services. Next slide, please. Folks may also be familiar with the county health rankings. So this is sort of an annual examination of health, both health outcomes, so how healthy residents are today, and health factors, sort of predictive, a look at how healthy residents will be in the future. This is published annually by the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute. And as folks will sort of see in this representation, in doing those rankings, about half of the sort of inputs are behavioral-based, health behavioral, plus clinical care, and the other half are sort of social and economic and physical environmental factors, including housing, which is what we're talking about today. I checked this earlier in the week and sort of was somewhat dismayed to see, but not surprised, that of the close to 70 counties in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia ranked among the least healthy, both in terms of health outcomes and health factors. Next slide, please. Another sort of display of that disparity, which I think we're all familiar with and increasingly focused on, is this from the VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, their mapping of sort of life expectancy based on sort of population factors. And here, and I think folks have probably seen this graphic before, we have that sort of shocking and staggering 20-year gap in life expectancy between a resident in Society Hill and a resident in Strawberry Mansion. So these are sort of the context within which we're thinking about how conditions impact resident health. So next slide, please. Turning to the tool of a health impact assessment, it's basically sort of a structured but somewhat flexible process for bringing together quantitative and qualitative data with community engagement to think about and identify the potential impacts of policies and practices on health outcomes. So the sort of framing here is how might, for instance, proposed changes to how the city does code enforcement affect health factors, i.e. housing, and potentially lead to different kinds of health outcomes. Next slide, please. To that structured part, back one, Eli, my bad. There are 6 different phases in a health impact assessment, starting with sort of screening, scoping, assessing, recommending, reporting, monitoring, and they each have sort of a series of tasks that are pursued. I'll sort of spill the beans here that in Philadelphia right now, in the health impact assessment that we are doing, we're in sort of the assessment phase. So we have engaged the Urban Institute to do a health impact assessment in Philadelphia, which they're pursuing in partnership with the Philadelphia Association of CDCs, that's really focused on strategic code enforcement. So the question here is like, how could our approach as a city to code enforcement be modified to better support resident health, and particularly to better support resident health for low-income households who are renters, responsive again to the terrific research that Octavia shared. Next slide, please. Generally, sort of, and this I think is the case to a significant extent in Philadelphia, health and housing are sort of separate, and policies that are targeted at housing and neighborhoods don't often focus on health as a primary policy goal or objective. Certainly appreciate and sensitive to the fact that that is starting to shift. We do have, health system stakeholders here in Philadelphia, including some of our local hospitals that are directly supporting programs tied to making improvements in patients' housing stock, appreciating that that has a positive consequences for individual and family health. But the sort of basic concept here, the words in blue in the call out box here, is that code enforcement departments could have a greater impact, positive impact on resident health if they brought those public health perspectives and strategies and metrics into their plans, and if there were better coordination across these different systems. Next slide, please. This is a overly busy, and I've done there we go. I was gonna say I've done a terrible job refining the slide, but a quite busy slide about the sort of concept of strategic code enforcement. So Octavia really clearly laid out how in Philadelphia's current regime, we've got a code enforcement approach that is complaint driven, largely reactive, and this is in no way a critique of L&I, would not probably be currently described as a strategic code enforcement approach. It is, again, sort of one that's driven by complaints, run by an agency with a whole slew of responsibilities that sort of grow by the year, and that is understaffed, and is not particularly targeted to necessarily sort of what we know about the health conditions and the housing conditions in different neighborhoods. A strategic code enforcement approach, which is what we might aspire to move to, is sort of the reverse of all of that. Next slide, please. So you might ask, why Urban Institute, Pew? What was the thought process here? So it turns out the team at Urban has done a very similar project down in Memphis. For any folks who are on the call, had a chance to join us at our online convening back in December. We were joined by Joe Schilling from Urban and Steve Barlow from Neighborhood Preservation Incorporated in Memphis, who partnered together on that project. And so the idea there, which we're sort of replicating here in Philadelphia, was to look at how you could do some silo busting, some cross-sector collaboration with the aim of code enforcement being better tooled to support resident health. Next slide, please. And I know I'm rushing through this, but mostly because I would love to get to your guys' questions. So the Memphis HIA did lead to a series of recommendations, and sort of just the 4 important quadrants here are proactive inspections, increased collaboration across code enforcement and public health and external stakeholders, broader coverage in terms of sort of additional resources and education and awareness raising, and a prioritization system. And in Memphis, one of the recommendations was for sort of an automated prioritization system. I should note, we hold up Memphis as an example of a strategic code enforcement approach and they are still quite early in the journey of implementing these recommendations. And some of their sort of early efforts were put on pause in response to the COVID pandemic, but the work there continues on. Next slide, please. So for our Philadelphia health impact assessment, we've got sort of a series of research questions that the Urban Institute team is pursuing. It's really building on and sort of amplifying the research that Octavia has done. And we are sort of in that assessment process. So there's both quantitative and qualitative work that's underway. I should take the opportunity here to express our sort of ongoing awe and admiration of the team at L&I, who have been just terrific partners in the research that Octavia produced and in this HIA process. So we are, working with them every step of the way. And I think what we are most interested in is coming up with a set of recommendations that are both sensitive to the context in which L&I operates and are very pragmatic and are quite clear about what changes in prioritization, what additional resources, what other adjustments would be necessary to put those recommendations in practice. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the HIA process does include sort of significant stakeholder engagement. And one of the mechanisms for that is something called a Project Advisory Group, or PAG. We go way heavy on acronyms at Pew, but it's like DAG, but it's a PAG, a Project Advisory Group. So the one that we are working with in Philadelphia, next slide, please, has already convened a couple of times and will be meeting again and sort of giving us feedback on recommendations, which are still in the process of being generated. And in composing the Project Advisory Group for our HIA here in Philadelphia, we sort of, with the constraint of in a Zoom environment, not having dozens and dozens of folks, although we had dozens and dozens of folks who we were hopeful to include, we tried to make sure that we had a cross-sector from landlord, developers, tenants, tenant advocates, city administration folks, developers, community development corporations, and others, and sorry, the health sector, very importantly. So these are our current PAG members who have generously been donating their time and helping us sort of think through some of these challenges. So just the sort of where things are with our health impact assessment, we are sort of in the fun and interesting and sometimes messy middle of it, sort of continuing to do quantitative data analysis, qualitative data analysis with focus group and key informant interviews, and getting to a series of recommendations, which we anticipate would be published by Urban Institute in the late spring. And once those do come out, we would welcome the chance to come visit with you all again, if appropriate, and or to otherwise sort of get your feedback and thoughts on the recommendations. We're appreciative of the fact that recommendations coming out does not make them real or implemented. And so there's a whole next phase of work that will be very locally based and hopefully involve lots of stakeholders in figuring out which ones might have legs and make the most difference. So that is, I think the next slide is just highlighting the words audience Q&A. So Eli, if you want to take us out of presentation mode, we'd be happy to be in conversation with DAG members.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I will stop my share here. Thank you for the presentation. I think a good place to jump into the Q&A is to back up a little bit to last year's Pew study, which David Feldman referenced, and that sort of aha moment about the mom and pop landlords. Can you talk a little bit about the findings of that report and how that led you down the path that you just presented?
So it really was a part of the same study. So we understood that we needed to know who we were thinking about when we were going to do this research. And we had a sense that we were talking about mom and pop landlords. We were aware of the idea that there were these out-of-state landlords who were coming in and taking over Philadelphia. And we wanted to be able to say, is there data to support or reject that notion? And so it was a part of the same process. And we suspected, though, that it would be what we found. I think the degree to which it was local landlords was surprising, and the degree to which it was both local and those who just had 1 or 2 units, I think was definitely an interesting and surprising thing, and kind of supported the fact that as any recommendations are made to address how we do this, it has to be sensitive to the fact that there's capacity, a limited capacity among those landlords.
So just David Brownlee. David, do you want to just unmute and ask your question?
Sure. I'm just wondering, it just seems that having tens of thousands of tiny landlords is probably impossible to regulate. I mean, with the best intentions in the world, can something be done to make it to bring all these tiny landlords into cooperatives or collaboratives or some other unit that could be more effectively and efficiently addressed at the regulatory and also the level of support, encouraging them to create, or basically trade groups to represent their own interests as well, which would in turn make them easier to would maybe pull some of them out of the woodwork, and make them and make bigger targets for organization and regulation, or any other ideas of dealing with this gigantic number of tiny businesses.
Octavia, can you remind me, because I used to have this top of mind and I can't remember. So the plurality of landlords are small, but the majority of units are in larger landlord-owned buildings. Can you just remind us of sort of what that context is?
What you said, I don't have the numbers in my head any longer. I think it's 2% of all landlords are large landlords. I believe that they own, I'm not sure the percentage, they own yes, you said the plurality of all units. I can't remember off the top of my head. I can pull it up and give it to you before we're done with this and put it in the chat. But yeah, it's like we definitely have tons of landlords that are dealing with a significant number of units, but not the majority of all units. And so I think that there is a concern for making sure that those landlords know what resources are out there, that they are known by the city, and that there are supports. I mean, I think to be fair, many of those landlords are using these small units as a part of their retirement and financial strategy. So their desire to offload them is not necessarily, is not there. There are some, we had done a study some years ago when I was at the Planning Commission and like talked to people. And yeah, there's some who end up as accidental landlords because they weren't able to sell. I think that may be less the case now where Philadelphia has a stronger market in different parts of the city. But I think that definitely thinking about how to re-engage or engage landlords in ways that the city can reach them and that they can be in communication, I think is certainly a helpful thing.
So one thing we, yeah, go ahead, sorry. No, please.
I was just seeing Emma's question here about sort of tenant perspectives. We do also have, as a member of the, and we tried to take sort of a balancing approach with sort of equal representation of landlords and tenants, but we have Nicole Lawrence from Turn as another sort of tenant specific member of the project advisory group. So thanks, Emma, for the question.
So one thing we talk a lot about when we're looking at new projects and zoning issues is how can we condense all this information to make it easier for community groups to understand the process. And well, at the start of the presentation, there's a lot of discussion of the different codes and different things that landlords have to meet. Are there any primers, checklists? Is there any data anywhere or anything condensed that allows them to sort of understand the process in a simplified way along the lines of some of these other checklists?
For I missed that part of your question. I'm sorry. For the landlords themselves.
Yeah, so that it makes the getting certified, understanding all the different codes to which they have to meet. Is there a primer? Is there a condensed document? Some sort of thing available to them? Does that make sense to develop?
I think so. There is, like I mentioned, that Partners for Good Housing handbook that does kind of lay out some of the responsibilities for being a landlord. But in terms of like really getting into the code, I don't think that document goes that far. There's some cities, I think Milwaukee may have a program where they train landlords, and they kind of have a process where they can, talk about how to be a good landlord, including the building maintenance stuff, but also thinking about dealing with problem tenants and things like that. So I don't believe that Philadelphia has a document that would, match what you're describing. It would be something building off of what already exists.
A quick one is, does the housing authority have to, do the same city regulations apply to the housing authority?
No, so the housing authority has their own rules that are determined by HUD. So they do have inspections. I'm not sure the frequency of them, but all of that is governed by HUD. And I actually believe that they have pretty stringent standards. Not the latest tragedy notwithstanding, I think it'll be interesting to see what the findings are there. But there is a process. It's just separate from Philadelphia's process.
So what remedies are available for retaliation, for reporting violations? What can be done to strengthen that? And do you have any data on what other cities do and to support renters in that respect?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Melissa. I mean, I think here in Philadelphia, the Human Relations Commission is the entity that does sort of receive and enforce complaints related to retaliatory evictions. I'm not personally familiar with how other cities handle it, but I think generally what we hear from advocates is that Human Relations Commission approach is sound. I think my understanding is that there is sometimes a bit of a mismatch between how that administrative process proceeds and how the court eviction process proceeds. And so that's likely a sort of ongoing challenge.
I wanted to touch Ariel's question here about code violations between the large landlords and the small landlords. In terms, I clarified that it was about the quantity and type of infractions that are being seen, and then I'll add sort of responsiveness to that.
So we didn't go into looking in detail the types of violations that we see from different types of landlords. That's not something that we did for this particular set of research. Might be a good follow-up though.
All right, well, David Feldman had a question. How do you suggest handling this sort of the tale of two different cities where you have one law? So I guess sort of following up on that last question is, if you were to extrapolate and propose a next set of research to how you treat sort of the different landlords, the mom and pops versus the larger corporate landlords that have, property management and all of that available to them, how would you go down that road to make sure that both were being appropriately overseen?
I mean, I think just thinking about the menu of services and resources that are available, like in that last slide, we talked about, some of them need a loan fund, some of them need enforcement. And I mean, I'm sure they all, the city's rental stock benefits from enforcement broadly. But I think one of the things that came across clearly in our interviews and what we heard is that we don't really want two sets of rules. One for some large landlords, another one for small ones. We want rules that can be enforced broadly and also sensitive to what the needs are of the landlords who are trying to implement and follow those rules.
And I think one of the things that we found, one of the things that I think it was in Octavia's research is that in some cities, in some cities with proactive inspections on a recurring schedule, the cadence of those inspections is tied to the number of units in a building, for instance. So sort of like efficiency arguments for that, perhaps, and also sort of predictability and sensitivity to landlord resources. So I think we should also, I should have set this frame also earlier, like we are not yet in recommendation making mode. This is very helpful because this conversation is helping us to sort of zero in and focus on like what areas should recommendations cover, but we're still in that sort of interesting middle period between the original research and getting to a set of recommendations.
Another thing, Sophie, just the quantity of units. One of the things that determines how frequently they may inspect is the state of repair of those units as they're coming in and doing inspections and finding that this property or this landlord, depending on the city, generally keeps their property in a state of repair. Then they will calibrate and inspect less frequently or more frequently if they find that this landlord or this property is a problem property. They will give a little bit more attention. So that's one way that there is sensitivity to what's happening in the unit.
So I want to go back to an earlier question that David Brownlee had about home ownership. If we have a lot of programs, and we've discussed them here at DAG about home ownership and how do you repair homes and how do you handle our enormous stock of row homes. The shift from homeowner to renter, is that an inevitable shift that you're seeing? Are there processes or desires to shift it back to more home ownership in a way that would help those small landlords sell to homeowners?
I mean, I don't know that I would say I think is an inevitable shift. We didn't really, we didn't spend a lot of time looking at that process. I mean, we do know that, we have a lot of homeowners that or a lot of residents coming into the city that are less inclined to own, or that are in a stage in life where they're not necessarily thinking about ownership. At the same time, properties are becoming less affordable than they used to be in Philadelphia. So there's lots of different factors that are contributing to renting becoming more prolific in the city of Philadelphia. I don't know so much about it being inevitable. I think as we are paying attention to the dynamics in the city, then we think about what the responses can be to address and support those who want to become homeowners or maintain their homes is another lane there.
So I'll combine David Brownlee and Rich's question here. Are there incentives that encourage landlords to register their properties? And is it fair to assume, is it correct to assume that it is the larger landlords who are more likely to register and therefore be easier to find and regulate?
So the incentives that exist are just the fact that you're not allowed to take someone to eviction court, and the fact that there is a $300 daily fine that's being levied, and the courts may choose to issue that. I mean, I mentioned that there's a limit on how much you can be charged in municipal court. That doesn't apply to common police court. There's an unlimited range. And so I think that threat of having to pay those fines is what we have in Philadelphia. Some other cities, I think, do have steeper penalties. I think some other cities, be thinking about other ways to address it, like that incentive that we mentioned in Phoenix. In terms of who registers, I think that in Philadelphia, it's a reflection of who's visible. If you have a house that is a row house, it's hard to know that this is a rental property at all. And so, yes, we do have, for example, in New York, that they were able to really distinguish that it's the larger properties that are more likely to be registered. I suspect that a similar thing is in place here in Philadelphia, just because of the invisibility of those units that are single, owned by an individual or look like a house.
That makes sense. And I'm just making sure that the data, thank you, Katie, for sharing the data on the Philadelphia landlords. I just put that link back at the bottom of the chat in case anyone missed it as it scrolled by. So you talked a little bit about next steps, and I just want to make sure we were clear, and I know this is a little rehashy, but could you talk about your next steps and both what you have planned and then extrapolating beyond that sort of dream scenario of where this all goes, 2 phases beyond?
Absolutely, and I appreciate the question, because it's also thought provoking. It makes us think farther down the road. So in terms specifically of what is planned, working with Urban Institute, will come up with which Urban will publish a series of a sort of analysis of the current conditions, impact on health factors, and a set of recommendations. And so I think we expect that's going to be published probably in May or June of this year. And then following that, the real fun begins, because there will no doubt be many more recommendations than could be taken up at one moment. Recommendations will have no doubt cost and budget implications, staffing factors. may also include sort of data systems or making currently siloed data systems talk to each other. So I think what our hope would be is to, in collaboration with local housing and development and health stakeholders, have a sort of ongoing process for vetting those recommendations and trying to reach, I don't think consensuses may not be achievable, but sort of elevate a set of recommendations that we would then put some sort of policy advocacy heft behind in trying to move forward. Some of this might be legislative, some of it might be regulatory. I think, until we sort of see what the set of recommendations are, it's a little bit hard to speculate. But I think this is sort of, Octavia's research is phase 1. This health impact assessment is phase 2. And then, Eli, to your great sort of what's on the horizon, there's probably 3, 4, 5 phases 3, 4, and 5 to follow, which we're really excited about. And I think, we know we will benefit greatly in those subsequent phases from the insights, the challenges from, and the collaboration with a whole set of stakeholders. So we're looking forward to that.
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer. And Mark Dodds just dropped some more information in the chat here about landlord size and affordability. Rob Cattell has a question about location of large landlords. Is there any data, any collection on where these landlords are? Are they local? Are they remote to Philadelphia?
We talk a little bit about that in the landlords report, but we didn't do a deep dive there. We can say that 20% of all landlords are located outside of the state, 60% are in Philadelphia. But I think, I just suspect there was a difference, if I recall, just kind of looking at that data, that there was a bit of a difference for larger landlords, but those data were not included in the report, and so I don't have them at the ready.
Wonderful. I think as we're getting to our time here, is it okay if I share the slide deck on our events page when we post our YouTube clip of the event?
Let me just send you a PDF form of it so folks don't have to be burdened by our notes. And then absolutely.
Yes, and I think we also want to share embed the links that have been put in the chat to the data sets. And maybe you could make a new final slide that has those if you would.
Happy to. Wonderful.
So yeah, so we will we are recording this, so we will be posting this on our website. It'll probably be up over the weekend, and we will get that slide deck and make sure that we are posting that as well, so anyone who wants to dig into that a little bit more can. So with that, I just want to thank you, Octavia, Sophie, for joining us. It was a really fascinating insight into the work that you're doing. Thanks for having us. What a pleasure. And please don't be strangers as you proceed with your work. Come back and share with us, and we'd love to have you join us again. We'd love to. Thank you. Well, take care. Bye. Everyone, we're on social media and posting on our website. We have those 3 new programs that will be going up very shortly. So grab tickets to those, send us a few bucks if you're so inclined, and everyone have a wonderful Thursday.